Normandy, France, June 14, 1944. Oberst Heinrich Voss stood at the edge of a cratered wheat field near St. Lo, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching American shells fall nearly 800 meters from their apparent target, a crossroads his men had abandoned 2 hours earlier. He lowered the glasses and permitted himself a thin smile. "Amateurs," he said to the young Hauptmann beside him. "Listen to the intervals, count the corrections. They're still searching for a target that no longer exists." He gestured toward the distant impacts, each explosion throwing up a geyser of Norman soil. This is what happens when you give unlimited ammunition to men who learned gunnery from textbooks rather than battlefields. Voss had commanded artillery since 1937. He had walked the frozen killing grounds outside Moscow, had watched Soviet artillery, brutal, massed, indiscriminate, bury entire divisions under steel. He knew what effective artillery looked like. It looked like mathematics married to murder, economy fused with violence. What the Americans were demonstrating, he told his staff that evening, was neither. "They have quantity," he wrote in his operational diary that night. "What they lack is the German artillerist's instinct, the ability to sense a target, to anticipate movement, to place the first rounds where they matter. They compensate for inaccuracy with volume. It is the difference between a surgeon and a butcher." His assessment was shared across the German command structure in those early June days. Reports filtering up from divisional artillery officers echoed the same refrain. American guns were plentiful, but poorly coordinated, their forward observers inexperienced, their fire direction primitive compared to German methods refined across 5 years of continental war. One staff officer at the 84th Corps headquarters described American artillery as an orchestra where every musician plays fortissimo, but no one reads the same sheet music. They had faced the British, whose guns were accurate but limited in number. They had survived the Soviets, whose barrages were apocalyptic but blunt. The Americans, they concluded, fell somewhere beneath both, dangerous only through sheer expenditure of shells. What Oberst Voss didn't know, what none of them could have known in those confident June days, was that the American artillery he dismissed was about to undergo a transformation so complete that German soldiers would soon speak of it in terms usually reserved for natural disasters. Within 6 months, the men who had mocked American textbook gunnery would cower in bunkers listening to shells burst with impossible precision directly above their heads. They would watch entire company positions vanish in concentration so accurate that survivors would swear the Americans could read their maps. They would write home about a new kind of death that fell from the sky, patient, precise, and utterly inescapable. The butchers, it turned out, had been surgeons all along. They were simply waiting for the right instrument. German confidence in their artillery superiority was not arrogance, it was arithmetic. By June 1944, the Wehrmacht had refined artillery doctrine through 5 years of continuous warfare across every conceivable terrain: the frozen steppes of Russia, the sands of North Africa, the mountains of Italy. Their methods had been tested against the largest armies on earth and had emerged, if not victorious, then at least respected. German artillery officers understood their craft with the intimacy of men who had practiced it under fire for half a decade. The foundation of this confidence rested on a single principle: precision through expertise. German doctrine emphasized the trained observer, the experienced battery commander, the artillerist who could read terrain, anticipate enemy movement, and place shells exactly where mathematics and intuition converged. Every round was expensive. Germany's industrial situation demanded economy. A German battery, firing 30 shells, was expected to achieve what other armies accomplished with 300. General Major Karl Thoholte, artillery commander for the 352nd Infantry Division defending the Normandy coast, articulated this philosophy in a briefing to his officers on June 3, 1944, just days before the invasion. "We will be outgunned," he admitted. "The Americans and British will land with more tubes, more ammunition, more of everything. This is irrelevant. One accurate shell accomplishes what 10 inaccurate shells cannot. We have accuracy. They have warehouses." This assessment drew on hard evidence. German intelligence had studied American artillery performance in North Africa and Sicily with clinical precision. The reports were not encouraging for the Americans. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American artillery had been slow to respond, poorly coordinated, and frequently outmaneuvered by German guns operating with half the ammunition. In Sicily, U.S. batteries had shown improvement but still relied heavily on pre-planned fires rather than the rapid adjustment that characterized German operations. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Mann, an artillery intelligence analyst at OB West Headquarters, compiled a comprehensive assessment in April 1944 that circulated among senior commanders. The American artillery arm, he wrote, demonstrates typical characteristics of a peacetime trained force thrust into combat. Their equipment is excellent. The 105mm howitzer is a capable weapon. Their 155mm guns are formidable. But equipment is not capability. Their forward observers are hesitant to call fire near friendly troops, their communication between batteries is cumbersome, and their fire direction centers lack the flexibility to respond to fluid tactical situations. Mann's report identified what he considered the fatal flaw in American artillery doctrine: centralization. The Americans had constructed an elaborate system of fire direction centers that theoretically allowed multiple batteries to mass fires on a single target. In German analysis, this system was too rigid, too dependent on telephone lines that combat would sever, too slow to respond to the chaos of battle. The Americans believe they can systematize warfare, Mann concluded. They build systems the way they build automobiles, standardized, interchangeable, designed for the average. But artillery is not average. It is an art practiced by masters, or not at all. Their system will collapse at the first serious test. The German officers had another reason for confidence. They had seen what happened when artillery faced truly determined opposition. On the Eastern Front, German batteries had dueled with Soviet guns for 3 years. The Soviets possessed excellent artillery. Their 76mm divisional guns and 122mm howitzers were superb weapons, and their Katyusha rockets could saturate an area with terrifying efficiency. But Soviet artillery, for all its power, was predictable. It followed rigid fire plans, rarely adjusted to changing situations, and could be avoided by troops who understood its patterns. If the Wehrmacht had survived the Soviet artillery, armies of guns stretching to the horizon, barrages that turned day into night, what threat could the Americans pose? The Americans who had never faced a first-class enemy in sustained combat. The Americans whose soldiers were raised on baseball and jazz rather than military discipline. The Americans who seemed to believe that industrial production could substitute for martial spirit. Major Werner Pluskat, commanding a battery of 88mm guns overlooking Omaha Beach, voiced the common sentiment on the night of June 5th. They will come with many guns, he told his crews. Let them. They will fire many shells. Let them. When their ammunition ships are empty and their barrels are worn, we will still be here. We have learned to survive artillery. We have learned from the Russians, who are masters of it. What can the Americans teach us that the Soviets have not? It was a reasonable question. The answer, when it came, would shatter everything German artillery officers believed about their profession, and about the enemy they had so confidently dismissed. What the Germans didn't understand, couldn't understand, was that the Americans weren't trying to match German artistry. They were building something else entirely. A machine, a system so comprehensive, so integrated, so relentlessly efficient that individual skill became irrelevant. The Germans had spent 5 years perfecting the violin solo. The Americans were about to unleash the orchestra. The revolution began in a classroom in Oklahoma, Fort Sill, 1930. The United States Army Field Artillery School, a sun-baked collection of brick buildings and firing ranges on the southern plains, was not where military revolutions typically originated. The army had shrunk to a skeletal force after the Great War, starved of funding and attention by a nation that wanted to forget that war existed. Artillery officers spent their days maintaining obsolete equipment and teaching doctrine that hadn't changed meaningfully since 1918. But in one office, a captain named Carlos Brewer was asking a question that would eventually kill more German soldiers than any single American weapon. Why, Brewer wrote in a memo to his commanding officer in March 1931, must we accept that massing artillery fire requires massing artillery batteries? Why can we not mask the fire while dispersing the guns? It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Traditional artillery doctrine, German, French, British, everyone's, assumed that concentrated fire required concentrated guns. If you wanted 12 batteries to strike a single target, you moved 12 batteries into position, which took time, created logistics nightmares, and presented the enemy with a target-rich environment. Brewer proposed something different. A mathematical and procedural system that would allow dispersed batteries to calculate firing solutions for the same target simultaneously, delivering massed fire without massed guns. His superiors filed the memo and forgot about it. But Brewer didn't forget. Neither did a small cadre of like-minded officers who rotated through Fort Sill over the following years. Men like Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, Major Orlando Ward, and Captain Ralph Groover. They worked on the problem in spare hours, scribbling calculations, arguing over procedures, testing ideas on the firing ranges when ammunition allocations permitted. By 1934, they had the skeleton of a system. They called it the Fire Direction Center. The concept was elegant in its ambition. Instead of each battery calculating its own firing solutions independently, a central facility would receive target information from forward observers, compute firing data for multiple batteries simultaneously, and transmit standardized commands that any trained crew could execute. The FDC would be the brain, the batteries would be the fists. "We are not trying to make artillerists think faster," Colonel Jones explained to skeptical colleagues at a 1936 demonstration. "We are trying to make thinking unnecessary. Every calculation, every procedure, every communication will be standardized to the point where a competent crew can deliver accurate fire without understanding the mathematics behind it. We are building a machine made of men." The skepticism was substantial. Traditional artillerists, including many senior officers, viewed the FDC concept as an insult to their profession. Artillery was an art, they argued, not a factory process. The best batteries were led by experienced officers who understood terrain, weather, and the intangible factors that no mathematical formula could capture. Reducing their role to executing pre-computed commands was degrading. Brigadier General Leslie McNair, who would later command Army Ground Forces, initially dismissed the concept. "You cannot systematize judgment," he wrote in 1937. "You are proposing to replace the artillerist's eye with the accountant's ledger." But the reformers had an answer to this objection, and it was devastating in its simplicity. The American Army didn't have experienced artillerists. It had almost no artillerists at all. When war came, and by the late 1930s, it was clearly coming, the Army would expand from 175,000 men to millions. There was no time to train generations of artillery masters in the German style. The only way to build an effective artillery force quickly was to build one that didn't require masters. Germany has artillerists who have fired 10,000 rounds in combat, Major Ward acknowledged in a 1939 planning document. "We have men who have never heard a gun fired in anger. We cannot compete on their terms. We must change the terms." The system that emerged from Fort Sill by 1941 was a triumph of procedural engineering. Every element was standardized. Target coordinates were reported using a universal grid system. Fire commands followed rigid formats that eliminated ambiguity. Communication procedures specified exact phraseology. Firing tables were pre-computed for every combination of charge, elevation, and range. A forward observer in the field needed only to identify a target, estimate its coordinates, and transmit a request. The FDC handled everything else. The technical specifications were demanding. Each division's artillery, 4 battalions of 105mm howitzers and 1 battalion of 155mm howitzers, would be linked by a web of telephone wire and radio nets. A divisional FDC could theoretically coordinate all 72 tubes to strike a single target within minutes of receiving a request. Corps-level coordination could mask the fires of multiple divisions. In theory, a single forward observer could call down the concentrated fury of over 200 guns. In theory. The system's true innovation wasn't technological. Radios and telephones weren't new, but procedural. The Americans had created a doctrine that assumed replaceable parts. Any trained forward observer could call fire for any battery. Any FDC could compute solutions for any guns within range. Any crew could execute any fire mission. The loss of a key officer wouldn't cripple the system because no officer was truly key. It was, as its creators intended, an industrial approach to artillery, mass production applied to mass destruction. But in 1941, it remained untested. The procedures existed on paper. The training programs were underway. The equipment was being manufactured. What no one knew, what no one could know, was whether the system would function under the stress of actual combat against an enemy who had been practicing the old ways and perfecting them for years. Captain Brewer, now a colonel, watched the first cohorts of FDC-trained artillerists ship out for North Africa in late 1942. "We've given them a weapon," he told a colleague. "Whether they know how to use it, whether it even works, we're about to find out." The answer would come in blood and fire, and before the system proved its worth, it would first have to survive its failures. Kasserine Pass, February 19th, 1943. The American artillery system died in the Tunisian mountains, or so it seemed to the Germans who watched it happen. General Major Friedrich von Broich commanded the 10th Panzer Division as it slammed into the untested American Second Corps defending the pass. His after-action report, submitted 3 days after the battle, contained an assessment that would circulate through German intelligence channels for months. American artillery, despite numerical superiority, proved incapable of coordinated response. Batteries fired independently, often at targets already abandoned. Forward observers were slow to adjust fire and frequently lost communication with their guns. The much-discussed Fire Direction Center system appears to exist more in theory than practice. Von Broich was not wrong. At Kasserine, everything that could fail did fail. Telephone lines were cut by German artillery within the first hours of the assault. Radio communications, already unreliable in the mountainous terrain, collapsed under the stress of combat. Forward observers, many experiencing their first battle, called in coordinates that were sometimes miles off target. One battalion of 105mm howitzers fired 1,400 rounds over 2 days. Post-battle analysis determined that fewer than 200 landed within effective range of any German unit. The FDC system, designed for controlled, methodical warfare, simply couldn't keep pace with the fluid chaos of a German panzer assault. By the time firing solutions were computed, transmitted, and executed, the targets had moved. German tanks that should have been destroyed by massed artillery instead rolled through American positions with near impunity. Lieutenant Colonel William Gruber, no relation to the Fort Sill pioneer, commanded the 27th Field Artillery Battalion during the debacle. His report was blunt. "We had trained for 18 months on procedures that assumed communication, coordination, and time. We had none of these. The Germans attacked like wolves. We responded like men reading from a manual while the building burned around us." The defeat was catastrophic. Over 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire artillery batteries were overrun, their guns captured intact. German propaganda photographs showed grinning Wehrmacht soldiers posing beside abandoned American 105mm howitzers, modern, well-maintained weapons that had barely been fired before their crews fled. In Berlin, the intelligence assessment was damning and confident. Oberst Alexis von Roene, chief of Foreign Armies West, compiled an analysis that reached Hitler's desk in March 1943. "The American artillery arm has confirmed our expectations," he wrote. "Their system relies on elaborate communications networks that cannot survive the friction of combat. Their personnel lack the tactical instincts that only experience provides. Their doctrine assumes a cooperative enemy who waits patiently while fire missions are processed. Against German mobile operations, they are functionally helpless." This assessment hardened into doctrine. German officers preparing for the expected Allied invasion of France were briefed that American artillery, while numerically formidable, could be neutralized by disrupting its communications and forcing rapid displacement. "Sever their telephone lines," one training document advised, "and their batteries become isolated instruments, no more dangerous than any other artillery force and considerably less flexible." The British were scarcely more impressed than the Germans. General Harold Alexander, commanding the combined Allied forces in North Africa, sent a private assessment to London in March 1943 that wounded American pride for years afterward. The American artillery has excellent equipment and poor technique. They fire enormous quantities of ammunition to little effect. One suspects they believe noise is a substitute for accuracy. Even within the American command, doubts festered. General Omar Bradley, who would later command American ground forces in Normandy, confessed in his diary that Kasserine had shaken his confidence in the artillery system. "We have built a machine," he wrote, "but we have not yet learned to operate it. The question is whether we can learn fast enough, or whether the Germans will destroy us before we do." The mockery from German ranks reached its peak in the spring of 1943. Prisoners captured in Tunisia reported that Wehrmacht soldiers had developed a nickname for American artillery, Feuerwehr ohne Wasser, the fire department without water. They made a great deal of noise rushing to the scene, but accomplished nothing when they arrived. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, a company commander in the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his wife in April 1943, "The American guns thunder day and night, but we have learned to ignore them. They fire at where we were, not where we are. Their observers are timid, their gunners slow. Yesterday, I watched a battery fire 30 rounds at an empty farmhouse, while my men ate lunch 200 meters away. If this is American artillery, we have nothing to fear from their invasion." Such confidence was widespread, and based on the evidence of early 1943, entirely rational. What Hartmann and von Broich and von Ruena couldn't see, was what was happening behind the American lines. The defeats in Tunisia had not broken the system, they had revealed its weaknesses, and the Americans, with their industrial mindset and their intolerance for failure, were already fixing them. New training protocols were implemented within weeks of Kasserine. Forward observers were pushed into more aggressive positions and taught to call fire danger close, within 100 meters of friendly troops, a practice the cautious pre-war doctrine had discouraged. Communication redundancy was tripled. If wire was cut, radio would take over. If radio failed, messengers would run. FDC procedures were streamlined, with unnecessary steps eliminated and authority pushed down to lower levels. Most importantly, the Americans did something the Germans never expected. They studied their own failures with ruthless honesty and refused to repeat them. "We learned more from Kasserine than from any victory," General Ernest Harman observed later. "The Germans taught us what our system couldn't do. We spent the next year teaching it what it could." In Sicily, 4 months later, the first hints of change appeared. At Gela, American artillery stopped a German panzer counterattack with concentrated fires that arrived faster than anything the enemy had experienced in Tunisia. The improvement was noted, but dismissed. German intelligence attributed it to favorable terrain and weak Italian support, rather than American adaptation. The mockery continued, the confidence remained. And in England, in the winter of 1943 to 44, the men who would land in Normandy trained on a system that had been rebuilt from its Tunisian wreckage, tested, refined, and waiting to be unleashed. The fire department had found its water. The Germans simply hadn't seen it yet. Saint-Lô, France, July 11, 1944. First Lieutenant Thomas Avery had been a high school mathematics teacher in Indiana before the war. Now he lay in a shallow ditch at the edge of a Norman hedgerow, binoculars pressed to his face, watching a German infantry company dig fighting positions 800 meters to his south. He counted them methodically. The teacher's habit never quite left him. 47 men visible. 2 machine gun teams, what looked like a mortar section setting up behind a stone farmhouse, an officer with binoculars of his own, scanning north, probably looking for exactly the kind of observer that Avery was. Avery keyed his radio handset. "Fire Direction Center, this is observer Able 7, fire mission, grid reference 437291. Enemy infantry company in the open, approximately 50 personnel, will adjust." The response came within seconds. "Able 7, FDC, fire mission received. Stand by for Battalion 3 rounds." What happened next was invisible to Avery. 8 kilometers behind him, in a farmhouse basement converted into the 29th Division Artillery's FDC, a sergeant transcribed his coordinates onto a firing chart. Within 90 seconds, the data had been computed, converted into gun elevations and deflections, and transmitted to 3 separate batteries, 12 guns in total, spread across 4 kilometers of Norman countryside. The German company below Avery had approximately 3 minutes to live. They didn't know it yet. They were still digging. "Shot over," his radio crackled. "Shot out," Avery confirmed. He watched through his binoculars. The German officer had lowered his glasses and was lighting a cigarette. 2 soldiers were laughing about something, leaning on their shovels. A peaceful summer morning in occupied France. Then the sky split open. 12 105mm shells arrived within a 2-second window, a technique the Americans called time on target, designed to deny the enemy the warning that ranging shots traditionally provided. There were no preliminary rounds to send men diving for cover. There was only silence, then apocalypse. The first shell detonated 3 meters above the ground, its proximity fuse triggered by the invisible radio waves bouncing off Norman soil. The burst scythed outward in a cone of steel fragments traveling at 900 meters per second. Before the sound of the explosion reached Avery's ears, 11 more shells had joined it. Where there had been a company, there was now a smoking circle of churned earth and shattered bodies. Avery's voice was steady, the teacher delivering a grade. Fire Direction Center, Able 7, target destroyed, estimate 40+ enemy KIA, no adjustment required, end mission. The entire engagement, from his initial call to the final transmission, had taken 4 minutes and 12 seconds. 800 meters away, Feldwebel Otto Brandt had been walking toward that company with a message from battalion headquarters. He was 200 meters short when the shells arrived. The concussion knocked him flat. When he raised his head, ears ringing, eyes streaming, he saw nothing where the company had been but smoke, scattered equipment, and shapes that no longer resembled men. There was no warning, he would tell interrogators 3 weeks later, after his capture near Coutances. No ranging shots, no sound of guns, just destruction, as if God had reached down and erased them. Brandt's testimony was one of hundreds that filtered back through Allied intelligence in July and August 1944. German prisoners, dazed and shaken, described the same phenomenon again and again. Artillery that arrived without warning, with impossible accuracy, in concentrations that seemed to read their minds. "We were trained to survive artillery," one captured Unteroffizier explained. "You hear the guns, you count the seconds, you estimate the trajectory, you take cover. But the American artillery, there is nothing to hear. The first shell is already killing you before your ears know to listen." The German doctrine of dispersion, spreading troops to minimize artillery casualties, proved worthless against an enemy who could mass fires from dispersed batteries onto any point within minutes. The doctrine of concealment failed because American forward observers seemed to be everywhere, patient and methodical, calling destruction down on any position that revealed itself. The doctrine of counter-battery fire, targeting enemy guns to suppress their fire, collapsed against an artillery arm that could shoot and relocate before German shells arrived. Oberst Heinrich Voss, the same officer who had dismissed American gunnery as amateur on June 14th, received Brandt's preliminary report on July 13th. His diary entry that night contained a single line that would never have appeared a month earlier. "Something has changed. I do not yet understand what." He was not alone in his confusion. Across the Normandy front, German commanders who had confidently predicted American artillery's irrelevance were confronting a reality that defied everything they thought they knew. The fire department had arrived, and they had brought more water than anyone imagined possible. The mathematics of destruction were relentless. By late July 1944, the American artillery system in Normandy had achieved a tempo of operations that German commanders struggled to comprehend. A single forward observer could now call fire from any battery within range, not just his own battalion, but any guns in the division, the corps, even adjacent corps if the situation demanded. The FDC network had become a nervous system spanning hundreds of square kilometers, capable of concentrating dozens of batteries on a single map coordinate within minutes. The Germans had no equivalent. They never would. On July 25th, Operation Cobra opened with an air and artillery bombardment that rewrote the rules of ground warfare. In the 5 hours before the infantry advanced, American artillery fired 140,000 rounds into a rectangle of Norman countryside 7 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep. Shells arrived at a rate of nearly 500 per minute, 8 every second, a sustained thunderstorm of steel that turned defensive positions into moonscapes. Lieutenant Wilhelm Krause, commanding what remained of a platoon in the Panzer Lehr division, survived by pure chance. He had been in a stone cellar when the bombardment began. When he emerged 4 hours later, he found that his platoon no longer existed. "I walked for 600 meters through what had been our defensive line," he wrote in a letter home that was captured before it could be sent. "I saw no living Germans. I saw parts of men I had known. I saw a Panzer IV turret resting upside down in a crater with no hull attached. I saw trees stripped of their bark, their white wood exposed like bones. The Americans had not attacked our position. They had unmade it, erased it, as if it had never been. The Panzer Lehr Division, an elite armored formation that had trained for years to spearhead German offensives, lost 70% of its combat strength in a single day. Not to enemy tanks, not to infantry assault, to artillery." General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, the division's commander, was interrogated after his capture in April 1945. His assessment of American artillery had evolved considerably from the confident predictions of June. "After Cobra, I knew we could not win," he testified. "Your artillery was not a weapon. It was a system, a machine that functioned independent of individual skill or courage. We had brave artillerists, experienced officers, superior guns in some cases. It meant nothing. You had industrialized the killing. We were craftsmen fighting a factory." The pattern repeated across the front. At Mortain in early August, a German counteroffensive designed to cut off the American breakout was shattered in 48 hours, not by the outnumbered American infantry defending the critical hills, but by artillery that fell with such precision that German tank commanders refused to advance. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a Kampfgruppe of the 21st Panzer Division, watched the Mortain attack collapse from a ridge 2 kilometers behind the front. His memoir, published in 1989, contained a passage that captured the psychological transformation German officers underwent that summer. "We had been told the Americans were amateurs, soft, dependent on machines because they lacked fighting spirit. But I watched their artillery at Mortain, and I understood that we had fundamentally misunderstood them. They were not dependent on machines. They had become the machine. Every shell that fell was precisely where they intended it. Every battery worked in concert with every other. There was no gap in their fire, no pause we could exploit. It was like fighting an enemy that never slept, never tired, never made mistakes." The Germans tried to adapt. They dispersed their forces more widely. But the American system could hit dispersed targets as easily as concentrated ones. They dug deeper, but the proximity fuses detonated shells at the precise height to maximize casualties in open trenches. They attempted counter-battery fire, but American guns displaced so quickly after firing that German shells fell on empty positions. Nothing worked. By August 1944, German unit diaries had begun to reflect something beyond tactical frustration: despair. Artillery fire throughout the day, impossible to move, impossible to resupply, impossible to evacuate wounded, read the war diary of the 353rd Infantry Division on August 7th. 3 company commanders killed by single concentrations, requesting relief, requesting ammunition, requesting anything. The relief never came. The ammunition dwindled. The anything was silence from higher headquarters, who had no solutions to offer. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Mann, the same intelligence analyst who had confidently predicted the American system would collapse at the first serious test, submitted a revised assessment to O.B. West on August 15, 1944. It read like a recantation. Previous analyses of American artillery capabilities must be regarded as fundamentally flawed. Their fire direction center system, far from being a rigid structure vulnerable to disruption, has proven to be flexible, redundant, and devastatingly effective. aggressive. Their forward observers display an aggressiveness we did not anticipate. Their ammunition expenditure, which we assumed would exhaust their supply lines, appears sustainable indefinitely. Most critically, their ability to mass fires from dispersed batteries has rendered our traditional defensive doctrines obsolete. We are facing an artillery arm that operates on principles we do not fully understand and cannot effectively counter. The report reached Berlin. It changed nothing. There was nothing left to change. In the hedgerows and villages of France, German soldiers developed their own vocabulary for what was happening to them. They called the American artillery Stahlgewitter, steel storm. They called the proximity-fused airbursts Hexenfeuer, witchfire. They called the TOT concentrations der Blitz, aus heiterem Himmel, lightning from a clear sky. They stopped calling it amateur. Feldwebel Werner Kruger, captured near Falaise on August 19th, was asked by his interrogator what he feared most about the American forces. His answer was immediate. Your artillery, not your tanks. We can fight tanks, not your aircraft. We can hide from aircraft. But your artillery knows where we are before we know ourselves. It sees through walls. It reads our thoughts. We cannot fight an enemy that is everywhere and nowhere, that kills us from beyond the horizon without ever showing its face. He paused. Then quieter. We used to think you could not shoot. Now I think you have simply been learning, and you have learned too well. The learning had only begun. By September, the American artillery would cross into Germany itself, and the soldiers of the Reich would discover that what they had experienced in France was merely the overture. The symphony of destruction was still building toward its crescendo. The numbers told a story that words could not capture. Between June 6, 1944, and May 8, 1945, American artillery in the European theater fired approximately 8.5 million rounds of 105mm ammunition alone. Add the 155mm howitzers, the 4.5-inch guns, the 8-inch heavies, the Corps and Army-level weapons, and the total approaches a figure so large it loses meaning. Over 12 million artillery rounds expended in 11 months of combat. But raw tonnage was not what made American artillery lethal. It was what that tonnage accomplished. Post-war analysis conducted by the U.S. Army's Operations Research Office determined that artillery accounted for approximately 58% of all German casualties on the Western Front, more than infantry weapons, armor, and aircraft combined. In certain operations, the percentage climbed higher. During Operation Cobra, artillery caused an estimated 72% of German losses. In the Hurtgen Forest, where dense woodland channeled defenders into predictable positions, the figure exceeded 80%. The German Army's own casualty reports confirmed what American analysts suspected. A systematic study of Wehrmacht field hospital admissions from July to December 1944 revealed that artillery fragments caused 61% of all wounds treated. The second leading cause, small arms fire, accounted for just 17%. German soldiers were nearly 4 times more likely to be killed or wounded by an American shell than by an American bullet. The efficiency was equally devastating. American artillery battalions in the ETO achieved a rounds per casualty ratio that stunned post-war researchers. A 1946 Army study calculated that, on average, it required 49 rounds of 105mm ammunition to inflict 1 German casualty during aimed observed fire missions. By comparison, German artillery, firing with the precision their doctrine demanded, averaged 67 rounds per casualty against American forces. The amateurs had become more efficient than the masters. Time on target missions, the technique that had erased companies without warning, were executed 3,847 times between D-Day and VE Day. Post-war assessment of these missions, based on aerial reconnaissance and captured German reports, estimated a cumulative German casualty count exceeding 31,000 from a technique that hadn't existed in American doctrine before 1943. The proximity fuse, the witchfire that German soldiers had learned to dread, transformed the lethality of every shell that carried it. Traditional artillery rounds exploded on contact with the ground, driving much of their fragmentation into dirt. Proximity-fused rounds detonated at optimal height, typically 4 to 8 meters above the surface, spraying steel fragments downward across an area 3 times larger than a ground burst. Against troops in open trenches or foxholes, the effect was catastrophic. A post-war study by the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory concluded that proximity fuses increased artillery effectiveness against personnel by 300 to 400%. The Germans had nothing comparable. They never developed a reliable proximity fuse. They never matched the FDC system's coordination. They never achieved the ammunition production that allowed American batteries to fire without conservation. They simply endured until they couldn't. The testimonies began accumulating before the war even ended. German officers, captured in the thousands during the final campaigns, were systematically interrogated about their combat experiences. Again and again, regardless of unit, rank, or front, they returned to the same subject. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army during the Normandy campaign, was interviewed at length in June 1945. His assessment was unequivocal. Your artillery was the single greatest factor in our defeat in France. We could match your infantry, man for man. German soldiers were at least equal to Americans. We could contest your armor. Our tanks were often superior to yours. We could challenge your air power with concealment and dispersion, but against your artillery, we had no answer. It was omnipresent, it was accurate, and it never stopped. My officers reported that they could not move, could not resupply, could not coordinate, could not do anything that required exposure to observation. Your guns paralyzed us. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded Panzer Group West during the critical July battles, offered a similar verdict. I have commanded armor in Poland, France, and Russia. I have seen the best artillery in the world, or what I thought was the best. The Soviet guns at Kursk were fearsome. The British at El Alamein were precise, but neither compared to what we faced in Normandy. The American artillery was not just effective, it was systematic. It functioned like a single organism spread across the entire front. We could destroy a battery, another would take its place. We could kill an observer, another appeared within hours. We were fighting not an army but a process, and processes do not tire, do not retreat, do not surrender. Even junior officers and enlisted men, whose perspectives were narrower but often more visceral, confirmed what the generals observed from headquarters. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, a mortar squad leader captured near Aachen in October 1944, was interviewed by an American intelligence officer who asked him to compare German and American artillery. There is no comparison, Becker replied. German artillery is an instrument played by a musician. American artillery is a factory that produces death. The musician may be more skilled, but the factory produces more. And in the end, it is quantity that kills you. Quantity and precision. You have both. We have neither anymore. Perhaps the most striking admission came from a source who had particular authority to judge. General Lieutenant Max Simon, who commanded the 13th SS Corps and had fought on the Eastern Front before his transfer to France, was asked during his post-war interrogation which enemy he considered most formidable. His answer surprised his interrogators, who expected him to name the Soviets. The Russian artillery was brutal, Simon acknowledged, massive, terrifying in its weight, but it was also predictable. We learned its patterns, its timing, its limitations. We survived it. The American artillery was different. It was precise where the Russians were profligate. It was flexible where the Russians were rigid, and it never seemed to diminish. We would destroy batteries, capture guns, disrupt communications, and the fire would continue as if nothing had happened. Against the Russians, we could find gaps. Against the Americans, there were no gaps, only steel falling endlessly, exactly where it would hurt us most. He paused, then added, I have been a soldier for 30 years. I have never feared anything on a battlefield. But by December 1944, I feared your artillery. Not as a soldier fears death. Death comes to all soldiers. I feared it as a man fears something he cannot understand. Something that seems to know him better than he knows himself. The factories at Fort Sill had produced exactly what their designers intended, a machine that turned mathematics into death, a system that made individual skill irrelevant, an industrial process that ground the Wehrmacht into dust. The artillerists who had once been mocked as amateurs had become the most lethal killers in the European theater, not because they were braver or smarter or better trained than their German counterparts, because they had built something their enemies never imagined, an orchestra that played itself. Remagen, Germany, March 9th, 1945. Oberst Heinrich Voss crouched in a shattered cellar on the eastern bank of the Rhine, listening to American shells methodically dismantle the town above him. Dust sifted down from the ceiling with each impact. Somewhere in the darkness, a wounded Hauptmann was praying in a voice barely above a whisper. 9 months had passed since that June morning near St. Lo, when Voss had watched American shells fall harmlessly on an empty crossroads and permitted himself to smile. 9 months since he had written in his diary about surgeons and butchers, about German instinct and American textbooks. The diary was gone now, lost somewhere in the retreat across France, along with his staff, his command, and his certainty. Voss had survived the hedgerows of Normandy, the catastrophe at Falaise, the desperate defense of the Siegfried Line. He had watched his regiment ground down from 3,200 men to fewer than 400. He had buried officers who had served with him since Poland. He had learned to flinch at the whistle of incoming rounds, to calculate the seconds between flash and impact, to know by sound alone whether a shell would land close enough to kill. He had learned, most of all, that everything he believed about American artillery had been wrong. The shells stopped falling. In the silence, Voss could hear the distant rumble of armor. American tanks crossing the bridge his engineers had failed to destroy. The war, he understood, was over. Not officially, not yet. But the Rhine had been crossed, the last natural barrier breached, and nothing remained between the American guns and the heart of Germany. He reached into his tunic and withdrew a small notebook, a replacement for the diary he had lost. By the light of a single candle, he wrote what would be his final entry. I have commanded artillery for 8 years. I believed I understood it, the mathematics, the physics, the art of placing steel on target. I was a fool. The Americans have not mastered artillery. They have reinvented it. They have built a system that makes every gun an extension of a single mind, a single will. We trained artillerists. They built a machine, and the machine has destroyed us. He paused, then added, I called them butchers. I was wrong. They are something worse. They are engineers. And they have engineered our annihilation with the same precision they use to build their automobiles and their radios. There is no malice in it, no passion, just efficiency. That is what makes it unbearable. Voss surrendered 3 days later, walking into American lines with the remnants of his regiment. 47 men, no officers above the rank of lieutenant, no functioning weapons heavier than a rifle. He was interrogated at a processing center near Koblenz, where a young American captain asked him almost casually what he considered the most effective American weapon. The question might have seemed absurd to the man Voss had been in June 1944. Tanks, aircraft, naval guns. Surely these were the decisive instruments of American power. But the man Voss had become knew better. Your artillery, he said quietly. It was always your artillery. We could hide from your planes. We could fight your tanks. But your guns, they found us everywhere. They killed us in our trenches, in our bunkers, in our sleep. They never stopped. They never missed. They were, he searched for the word, inescapable. The captain nodded, made a note, moved on to the next question. Voss spent the remaining months of the war in a prisoner of war camp in France. He returned to Germany in 1947, took a job as a mathematics teacher in a Stuttgart gymnasium, and never spoke publicly about his wartime service. He died in 1978, leaving behind a box of papers that included his Normandy diary and his final notebook. His granddaughter donated the collection to the Bundesarchiv in 1995. Researchers who examined the documents noted the stark transformation in Voss's assessments, the confident dismissals of June 1944 giving way to bewildered respect by March 1945. One archivist summarized the trajectory in a marginal note. A professional officer confronting the obsolescence of everything he knew. The American artillery system that broke Voss and his army did not disappear after 1945. It evolved. The Fire Direction Center concept became the foundation of every modern artillery doctrine, adopted by NATO allies and studied by adversaries. The proximity fuse was declassified and revolutionized everything from anti-aircraft weapons to space exploration. The techniques developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s, standardization, redundancy, systematic coordination, became the template for military operations in the nuclear age. But the human cost remained, etched in the memories of those who survived it. In 1962, a reunion of Wehrmacht veterans was held in Munich. Several attendees had served on the Western Front, and the conversation turned, as it often did, to the question of what had defeated them. The usual explanations were offered: Allied air superiority, American industrial might, Hitler's strategic blunders. Then a former Feldwebel named Werner Kruger, the same man who had told his interrogators that American artillery sees through walls and reads our thoughts, spoke up. "We have talked about many things," he said. "Planes, tanks, supplies, politics, but no one has mentioned what actually killed us, what broke our divisions, shattered our morale, made us afraid to move in daylight. It was not the American soldier, it was not the American general, it was the American shell, falling exactly where it would hurt us most, at exactly the moment we were most vulnerable, day after day, without end." He paused, looking around the room at men who had shared his experience. "We laughed at them in the beginning. We called them amateurs. We said they could not shoot." His voice dropped. "They heard us laughing, and then they taught us what shooting really meant." The room was silent. Somewhere in an archive in Koblenz, a faded diary page still carries Oberst Heinrich Voss's confident assessment from June 14, 1944. They compensate for inaccuracy with volume. It is the difference between a surgeon and a butcher. He was right about one thing. The Americans did compensate with volume, a volume of fire so vast, so precise, and so relentless that it made the distinction between surgeon and butcher meaningless. In the end, it didn't matter what you called them. What mattered was that when their guns spoke, men died, and their guns never stopped speaking.